Ford built two completely different muscle cars in 1969, and most Americans have never heard of the one that might have been faster. While the Boss 429 Mustang was dominating NASCAR and shutting down American street racers, Ford Australia was engineering the Falcon GT-HO Phase III to conquer a 500-mile endurance race that would destroy anything Detroit ever built. Same company, same year, two wildly different approaches to going fast. The Boss 429 came from Ford's desperation to legalize their Hemi-killing NASCAR engine for the track. NASCAR's homologation rules demanded 500 street versions, so Ford crammed a 429 cubic-inch semi-hemispherical beast into the Mustang's engine bay. The catch? The engine was so massive, they had to completely re-engineer the shock towers, move the battery to the trunk, and hand-build every single one at Kraft in Michigan. The sticker price hit $4,832 in 1969 when a base Mustang cost $2,618. Meanwhile, 10,000 miles away in Australia, Ford's competition department faced a different problem. The Bathurst 1000 wasn't a quarter-mile sprint or a 500-lap oval. It was 161 laps around Mount Panorama, a 3.86-mile circuit with elevation changes that would make a fighter pilot nervous. The GTHO Phase III needed to survive full-throttle runs down Conrad Strait at 160 miles per hour, then immediately brake for a hairpin while the brakes were glowing red. Here's where it gets interesting. The Boss 429 made 375 horsepower on paper. Everyone knew that number was a complete lie to keep insurance companies happy, but Ford stuck to it. Dyno tests showed closer to 500 horsepower at the crank. The Falcon GT-HO, Ford Australia rated it at 300 horsepower. Also a lie, but in the opposite direction. The Cleveland 351 was so underrated that independent testing proved it was making over 380 horsepower, with some saying it hit 400. The engineering philosophies couldn't have been more different. Ford Detroit built the Boss 429 for one thing, turning left for 500 miles on a banked oval while beating Chrysler's Hemi. They designed a semi-hemispherical combustion chamber with canted valves, aluminum heads, and a forged steel crank. The intake manifold sat so high they had to use a special hood with a massive scoop. This engine was overkill for street use, and everyone knew it. The hydraulic lifters, mild camshaft, and 10.5-to-1 compression ratio meant it was detuned from its race spec just to make it drivable. Ford Australia took the opposite approach. They started with Cleveland's 351 four-barrel engine and asked, how do we make this survive 161 laps at Mount Panorama without grenading? They didn't need a show engine with a giant hood scoop. They needed an engine that could run at redline for 6 hours straight. The GTHO Phase III used a Holley 780 cubic feet per minute carburetor, special cam timing, reworked heads, and a dual-point distributor. But the real genius was in the details nobody saw. Oil cooler routing, upgraded valve springs, and a harmonic balancer that could handle sustained high RPM operation. The transmission choices reveal everything about these cars' intended missions. The Boss 429 came with a close ratio top-loader 4-speed manual. First gear was basically unusable on the street because the engine made so much torque. You either slipped the clutch and cooked it, or you dumped it and roasted the tires. Second gear got you to 60 miles per hour if the rear end didn't step out. Third and fourth were for highway cruising, which is something you rarely did in a Boss 429 because the fuel economy hovered around 8 miles per gallon. The Falcon GT-HO got the same top-loader 4-speed, but with completely different gear ratios optimized for Bathurst. The Australian engineers knew they'd be shifting through those gears hundreds of times during the race, so they spec'd ratios that kept the Cleveland in its power band through every corner at Mount Panorama. The shifter had to be precise because missing a shift at 7,000 RPM meant you were either hitting the rev limiter or worse, money shifting and destroying the engine. Rear axle ratios tell the story even clearer. The Boss 429 typically ran a 3.91 to 1 or 4.30 to 1 gear, built for launching hard off the line and getting to 100 feet as fast as possible. Ford Australia installed a 3.50 to 1 Detroit locker in the GTHO, which sounds milder until you realize it was calculated specifically for hitting 160 miles per hour down Conrad Straight without over-revving the engine. That's the difference between quarter-mile thinking and endurance racing reality. Weight distribution separated these cars more than the spec sheets revealed. The Boss 429's massive engine sat entirely in front of the front axle. Ford tried to compensate by relocating the battery to the trunk, but you still had over 3,800 pounds with 58% of it on the front tires. That meant brutal understeer in corners. You could power through it with all that torque, but the Boss wasn't going to outhandle anything unless you were drag racing in a straight line. The Falcon GT-HO Phase III weighed in around 3,450 pounds, and Ford Australia obsessed over every ounce. They stripped sound deadening, used thinner glass, and specified lighter seats. More importantly, the Cleveland 351 was a physically smaller engine than the 429, so more weight sat between the axles. The GTHO wasn't winning any awards for perfect 50-50 balance, but it could actually navigate corners without plowing straight into the wall. Suspension setups revealed the real divide between American muscle and Australian touring car engineering. The Boss 429 rode on heavy-duty springs and shocks designed to handle all that nose weight and keep the car pointed straight during a quarter-mile blast. The ride quality was punishing. Every expansion joint telegraphed through the chassis. Ford didn't care because nobody bought a Boss 429 for the daily commute to work. The GTHO's suspension had to handle sustained cornering loads at speed while soaking up the bumps and elevation changes at Bathurst. Ford Australia fitted heavy-duty springs and shocks, but they were valved completely differently. The GTHO had to put power down coming out of corners without lighting up the inside rear tire. It needed to brake from 160 miles per hour without the nose diving so hard that you lost front-end grip. That meant careful attention to anti-roll bars, spring rates, and damper settings that would seem way too soft for an American muscle car. Brake systems highlight the fundamental difference in what these cars were built to do. The Boss 429 came with front disc brakes and rear drums, which was standard for American muscle in 1969. Ford figured you'd use the brakes once per quarter-mile pass to slow down after crossing the finish line, maybe twice if you missed your exit on the highway. The brake system worked fine for that limited duty cycle. The Falcon GT-HO Phase III needed brakes that could haul 3,450 pounds down from 160 miles per hour, lap after lap, for 161 laps. Ford Australia installed larger front rotors, upgraded calipers, and added a brake booster that could handle repeated hard stops without fading. They tested the brake cooling ducts in wind tunnels because brake fade at Mount Panorama meant you were either off the track or into the wall. There was no middle ground. Fuel systems expose another engineering divide. The Boss 429 had a single Holley 735 CFM carburetor feeding that monstrous engine, which sounds undersized until you realize Ford was trying to make this car pass emissions and keep insurance companies from jacking rates into the stratosphere. The fuel tank held 20 gallons, which gave you maybe 150 miles of range if you drove it gently. Most Boss 429 owners knew every gas station within a 50-mile radius. The GTHO's Holley 780 cubic feet per minute carburetor was calibrated for sustained high-load operation. Ford Australia needed the car to run flat out for 6 hours without the engine leaning out and eating pistons. They ran extensive dyno testing to dial in the fuel curves, which meant the GTHO actually ran richer than most American muscle cars at wide-open throttle. The 72-liter fuel tank was positioned carefully to maintain proper weight distribution, even as fuel load decreased during the race. The homologation stories reveal how different the rules were in each market. NASCAR demanded 500 Boss 429 Mustangs to legalize the engine for competition. Ford built 859 in 1969 and 499 in 1970, every one of them hand-assembled at Kraft. Each car came with a detailed build sheet documenting modifications. Buyers knew they were getting a race car that happened to have license plates. Ford Australia had to build 200 GTHOs to meet Australian touring car regulations. They made exactly 300, and every one of them sold immediately, even at a price that was double what a standard Falcon cost. Australian buyers understood what they were getting: a race car engineered to win Bathurst, with enough street manners to drive it home after writing the check. Real-world performance tells the truth these spec sheets tried to hide. The Boss 429 ran the quarter mile in the high 13-second range, hitting 106 miles per hour in street trim. Drag racers with experience could get them into the low 13 seconds. That was quick for 1969, but nowhere near what you'd expect from a 500 horsepower engine. The problem wasn't power, it was getting that power to the ground without spinning the tires all the way through second gear. The GTHO Phase III never cared about quarter-mile times, but when journalists tested it anyway, they recorded 14.4 seconds at 100 miles per hour. Sounds slower than the Boss 429, except the GTHO could then go do that for another 160 laps without braking. More importantly, around Bathurst, the GTHO lapped at times that embarrassed everything else Ford built worldwide, including cars with way more horsepower. Top speed numbers reveal the final truth. The Boss 429 was geared to hit about 118 miles per hour in the quarter mile, and that was basically all she had. The engine ran out of breath beyond 5,800 RPM, and the brick-like aerodynamics meant you weren't going much faster, even with more gear. Ford built it to dominate NASCAR's super speedways, where the race version made 700 horsepower and could draft at 190 miles per hour. The street version was the admission price to race. The Falcon GT-HO Phase III was clocked at 141 miles per hour down Conrad Straight during the 1971 Bathurst 1000, and that was with race-required modifications limiting power. The production version could hit 153 miles per hour given enough road. Ford Australia engineered the aerodynamics specifically for high-speed stability because Mount Panorama demanded it. The GTHO didn't just hit those speeds once. It hit them lap after lap while still having enough in reserve to brake, turn, and do it again. These two Fords represent completely different definitions of what a muscle car should be. The Boss 429 was America's answer to unlimited horsepower in a straight line. Build the biggest engine possible, cram it in the lightest body you could find, and worry about everything else later. It worked brilliantly for NASCAR and drag racing, which is exactly what Ford intended. The GTHO Phase III was Australia's answer to real-world racing conditions where horsepower alone meant nothing if you couldn't make it around the next corner. Ford Australia proved you didn't need the biggest engine to build the fastest car. You needed the right engine, engineered properly for the task, with suspension, brakes, and gearing that worked together as a system. Both cars deserve their legendary status. The Boss 429 represents the absolute peak of American muscle car excess, when manufacturers built race engines for the street and somehow convinced people it made sense. The Falcon GT-HO Phase III shows what happens when you engineer a car for actual racing conditions instead of straight-line bragging rights. Which one's better? That depends entirely on what you're trying to do. If you want to dominate cars and coffee, smoke the tires at every stoplight, and know you're driving one of the rarest Mustangs ever built, the Boss 429 wins. If you want to actually race the car hard, lap after lap, and drive it home when you're done, the GTHO takes it. Both are icons. Both are proper muscle cars. They just define muscle in completely different ways. The real winner? We are, because Ford built both of them in the same year, proving the best automotive engineering happens when you let smart people solve different problems in different ways. The Boss 429 and GTHO Phase III are proof that there's no single right answer to building a fast car. There's only the right answer for what you're trying to accomplish.